Welcome to Natural Habitat Adventures Daily Dose of Nature. Let's go discover Arctic trails as we follow Arctic tales. Presented by Nat Hab Expedition Leader Kristina Disney. Thank you so much for being here today, Kristina. I'm going to hand it off to you.
Great, thank you very much, Kendall. It is a pleasure to be here. As she said, my name is Kristina Disney. I've been a guide with Natural Habitat since 2018, and I'm very, very excited to speak with you guys about dog sledding today. It has been something I've loved since a kid, and I was fortunate enough in winter of 2016, 2017, to train dogs for the Iditarod. So not only am I more or less in love with Canada's North, but I also got to spend time with some of our canine friends. And as many of you are joining, I'm sure some of you have probably seen some of these films, or certainly the Hollywood references to dog sledding. And it is certainly a romanticized view. Some of the stories are true. I will say that people don't actually say the word mush. This is something I learned firsthand and cleared that one up for myself. And yeah, the actual intonation of that is because the sound is too soft. So the mush sound, when you have all these yapping dogs who are going at the top of their lungs, the sound gets lost. So usually when you start a dog team, you use words that have those consonants. So you do say, let's go, or things like that. And so today we're gonna delve into some of the history of dog sledding. We're going to delve into the evolution, both of the sport a little bit, and the mode of travel, as well as the evolution and adaptations of our four-legged friends. And so the history of dog sledding goes back a long way, but I actually want to take us back to the turn of the century. So if you look on the photo on the left there, that's a photo of Raoul Amundsen. And so as you can see at his feet there is laying down a dog sled team. And the photo on the right is a group of Shetland ponies that were shipped to the South Pole. So these were two polar explorers that were racing to the South Pole in 1911 because they wanted to be the first ones to make it there. And for anyone who's a big history buff, you'll know that Amundsen made it there first by only a few weeks. I believe he made it in December of 1911, and the group led by the British explorer Robert Scott, I think he made it in January. So it was so close, right, that race. And it came down to a lot of different factors, certainly, but I think that one of the most interesting ones is really that it came down to their choice and mode of travel. So the Norwegian explorer Amundsen, he chose to travel by dog sled, while the British group chose to take ponies. And though ponies are very well adapted, and especially the Shetland and Icelandic pony cross, those pony crosses are very hardy, there's something to be said for that adaptation that those dogs are able to carry forward. And so humans have been living alongside sled dogs for a very long time. And archaeologists have actually found that we've only been using the northern sled dog as a sled dog since about 800 AD. But they've been living alongside humans, specifically communities in the Arctic, for a very, very, very long time. And so before that time, there's evidence that they were used for hunting, they were used for pack animals. I really love this photo. I think it just shows how similar they are become, right? They both they're loaded up, they've got their head there, and they're making their way forward, right? They're moving camp. And so we're going to refer to as Inuit dogs for our presentation. And so when we look at this photo, you'll see, you see those dogs and they're they've got their backs to the wind, and you can see them bird up, and it's this big open expansive landscape, and you can see the people are equally bundled up. And there's something to be said for that, because when we look at this, maybe to you and I who aren't from here, this looks like they're maybe cold or uncomfortable, but really this is the environment they're adapted for. This is the environment that their whole bodies, everything has come to not just survive, but to thrive in. And that's speaking from experience. I have lived in a few different northern communities, and often people will adopt dogs from the north and try to bring them south. And if you adopt a dog, let's say from like northern Quebec, that's essentially spent the first years of their life, when they come south, they have a very hard time adapting to our climate, even though, especially summers, their coats are so thick, and even though they'll shed and grow, their metabolism never truly shifts over. And I myself really love learning languages, and Inuktitut is the language that the Inuit speak. And so the Inuktitut word for the Inuit sled dog is kimik. And an interesting thing about Inuktitut is that it's spelled with Q's. That's that kimik, but those sounds all come from the back of your throat. So if you want to try and make that sound at home, it's not that K that comes near the front of your mouth, but you really want to feel that kind of vibration lower down. So it's kimik. That's the sound you're looking for. And one thing I also want to clear up while we're doing our history run is that people often think that sled dogs were born out of these crosses with wolves, right? That there's stories of Inuit mushers leaving their dogs out, the females out to be bred by wolves. And this is very much highly unlikely. Wolves would have definitely considered that an easy snack. I mean, there are exceptions. This certainly does happen and did happen, but it wasn't, let's say, common practice. And so they really are, you could say, they are identified as a species of their own. Their build is so different, their lifestyles are so different, and in the same with the story of many species, that they actually nearly went extinct. So the photo on the left there is a picture of an Inuit community in the far north. And so what happened in the 1970s and 80s is that the Canadian government actually enlisted the RCMP, so that's our Royal Canadian Mounted Police, in all these communities to round up as many sled dogs as possible and actually euthanize them, which I know is not a pleasant thought. And the reason why the government did this was because at the time they were trying to remove the nomadic lifestyle from northern communities. And so the government has come out and actually apologized for this in 2019. So this is very recent in the minds of a lot of Canadians, I guess, you could say, is that they apologize for these colonial practices in the sense of trying to force them into sedentary lifestyles, force them into a certain way of living. And yeah, so families were relocated to specific communities. Their sled dogs were taken away. It was a really, really hard time, and it's certainly not something to be proud of, but I think that it's something that needs to be talked about as something that happened, and acknowledging our history, for better or for worse, so that we can understand where we are today. So these dogs were almost entirely wiped out. They were down to only a few hundred in the whole Arctic and subarctic. And so there was a recovery project made to try and to keep the breed alive, because they really are unique, and they're the official dog of Nunavut. And so Nunavut is actually Canada's most recent territory, which is something that even many Canadians often forget to think about. So we have 3 northern territories: Yukon, Northwest Territories, and Nunavut. And Nunavut only became its own territory in 1999, which, yeah, as for myself, I will admit that I didn't even think about that growing up. So it's kind of this recent history, these changing of lifestyles, and the sled dog really plays a role in that. Oh, and I guess one more sort of language thing, because I think that's really cool, is that when you in the future, if you're ever talking about Inuit, so Inuit actually means people. So you would never need to say Inuit people, because that would be saying like the people. You can just say the Inuit as a good factoid to carry forward. So we've sort of had a look at the relationship between humans and sled dogs and how that's developed through time. But now I actually really want to hone in on the evolution of sled dogs themselves and how it is that they've come to do so well in the north. So our little friend here is not a sled dog. Our little friend is an Arctic fox. But the Arctic fox and the Canadian sled dog do share a lot of similarities. So one is they tend to have shorter ears. So if you think about that, there's less surface area for there to be heat loss or to freeze those tips. Anyone who's from a northern climate, depending on where you're watching from, you'll know that can happen sometimes, right? You'll get cats or dogs will come in and then they'll get that burn around the side. And another adaptation is specifically their tails. So if you look at an Arctic fox's tail, it's very, very thick, very, very bushy. And you can see our friend here is so wrapped up nice and tight with his tail. And partially that's an insulation factor. They purposely sleep on their tail to give them that little bit more space off of the snow and that little bit extra layer of insulation. Another really cool thing is that the Arctic fox shares in common is that they actually have counter-current circulation with their paws. So if you think about the blood going in and out, so the blood is doing a heat exchange sort of in their wrists so that their paws are generally colder, but they're not losing that heat when it goes back, or they're not having to warm that blood again when it goes back in. But certainly the biggest adaptation is their fur. Now you'll have to, I apologize, this is not a sled dog fur. This is actually an example of seal's fur that you can see the hair, but it's just such a good visual. And so it's the whole idea of that outer coat or those guard hairs in the undercoat. And essentially air is one of the best insulators, right? So when you have these two different coats, you can essentially trap air in that under sort of more fuzzy layer, which provides an amazing amount of insulation. And this is a feature that so many different polar species use. It's how they're able to keep warm. And one last aside about the Arctic fox, just because I think they're very, very cool. I did some studies on them, and I remember looking at this research 5-6 years ago. And they essentially were trying to figure out the lower critical body temperature of these different species. So lower critical temperature is essentially the temperature your body shivers at. So for you and I, for humans, it really doesn't take very much. We can, somewhere around that 10 degrees Celsius, 5 degrees Celsius, we will start to shiver. And what that shiver response is it's your body needing to actually actively create more heat than what you're doing. So your body's like, all right, we need to warm up, we're losing too much heat. And so they put all these different animals in these giant walk-in freezers. So they put in a Hereford cow, and the Hereford, I think, started to shiver somewhere around -15. They put in a bison, and I believe the bison didn't start to shiver somewhere until around, it was very close to -30. And they put in an Arctic fox. And so they were doing this study in the, I can't remember where they were doing it, but they couldn't get the freezer to go cold enough so that the Arctic fox would shiver. They could only turn the freezer down to about -65 degrees Celsius, which meant that it was so insanely cold, but they still can get. So what they ended up doing was they shipped a fox to a very special freezer, I think in Seattle, and as it turns out, it would take more than 100 degrees Celsius for a full winterized coat Arctic fox to start to shiver. So that's how amazingly insulated these little guys are. But back to sled dogs. Sorry, I couldn't help but tangent on the Arctic fox. Everyone loves a good Arctic fox. And so another adaptation is actually the fur between their toes. And so this is one of those adaptations that kind of comes back to racing. So when you look at the fur between their toes, that essentially keeps the ice, right? So when they're running, we don't often think about it because we wear boots, but ice is quite sharp. Snow is sharp, and if you're walking that all day, so that can really hurt. And so between their toes, and for those of you who have pets, you'll know the skin between the toes is very soft and very sensitive. And so that fur makes sure that the ice and the cold stays out. But the other thing that happens is that when they're running, the ice builds up on their feet, And then that can actually hurt them as well. So for anyone who's seen photos of dog sledding or movies or things like that, sometimes you'll see, like our dog on the left here, that they have little booties. And so the whole point of those booties is to keep the ice from building up between their toes. And as a dog sledder, something fun, so often when they're running, these will fall off. Not too often, but let's say in a race, you might lose, 3, 4, 5, depending on how long you're going for. And so it's sort of like a game within a game while you're racing, is to see if you can catch those ones. So you'll lean off the sled and try and snag a booty on your way by and pick them up while you're still racing. It gets pretty fun. Another adaptation, so far we've talked about physical adaptations, but another adaptation to keep in mind is their behavior. So sled dogs are really considerably more aggressive than other breeds of dogs that you might think about. They're very intensely pack orientated. They have a very strong sense of hierarchy, very, very similar to their wolf cousins, like I've pictured here. And so to you and I mean, I was not the one who took this photo, so I don't know the entire pre-story for it. But to you and I, when we look at this, there seems to certainly be a lot of tension in the group. And having worked with sled dogs, I guess I should say, so when I was training sled dogs, I worked in a kennel with 50 dogs. And when you live in a pack of 50, there is a very interesting and complicated hierarchy that exists there. And so to me, what you're seeing on the screen is something I would see quite regularly, a scene something like this. And so the dog on the bottom that's laying down, there is some aggression there, but often there isn't any malice behind it. It's simply they assert dominance, assert the role in the pack, and when that's over, up they come and they're all friends again. But it can be very intense, and one thing that we would see very often is that once they submit in that pose, and they might challenge, they submit, then the alpha usually leaves them alone. There's no additional aggression, there's no anything, but it is a very swift action. You'll see, and that's within themselves. There's no outside influence, but they live like that because they do have to. It's still that need to sort of survive and rely on one another. It's still so strong. So definitely fascinating to get to be a part of for a time. And though this might not sound like the most exciting part, the coolest adaptation, I think, of sled dogs is their metabolism. And if you give me a little bit, I'm hoping I can sell you on that as well. So the thing about it is that when they're in a race, or just in general living up north, is that water is this interesting thing to try and come by. Because yes, you're surrounded by snow, but it's not exactly accessible, right? When you think about the cold and the ice and everything. So we as humans, or dogs, or really any species, we consume water in 3 ways. First is just actually drinking water, which is what we're going to call free choice water. So if you're a dog, if you're someone's pet, you've got your nice bowl of water. But if you're a wolf, or if you're a sled dog, liquid water is hard to come by. You might cross a stream at some point and drink out of that. But really, especially in the wintertime, there isn't a lot of, most of it's snow, right? Or most of it's ice, or it's covered. And so that would take a lot of energy. And so the second form of water that we often sometimes forget about is actually the water content in our food. So this is just sort of a little general set of numbers, right? But when we look at the percent of water, think about chicken, right? 60% of that is water. So when your body breaks that down and extracts the proteins and fats and things, you are still getting some water with that food. So that's a really big part of it. And the third way that we get water from our food is metabolic water. And so essentially what that means is that when we're breaking down sugars and starches and fats, we actually, in the process of breaking that down in our body, do create water. Now, I fully confess that when I took molecular biology and genetics and all the teeny tiny stuff, that I barely passed. I'm pretty sure I made it through that class with just a barely passing mark. Might even had a nice professor who gave me that 1 degree. So this is by no means my strong suit. So don't feel too intimidated by that diagram. Basically, the moral of the story is just that when our body breaks it down and we have the energy, but we also then produce water. So if you're a sled dog, they can actually get up to about 20% of their water just from this process. So humans, we are not nearly as efficient. So when you and I eat something, we don't actually break down the fat in a way that we can access the water. But if you're a sled dog, you certainly do. And so sled dogs, when they're in a race and they're doing that, so think about this, 60% of their diet is fat. So if they're in a race, they're eating somewhere between 8,000, 12,000 kilocalories in a day. And for you and I, if we were to eat that many calories, that would be the same as if we tried to eat 40, 50 cheeseburgers. They are rolling through it. And it's pretty actually impressive when you think about it that way, that they're able to convert that fat not only into energy, but also into water, which is a huge part when they're so insanely active. Now, I know I can't hear you or see you, but I'm certain that some of you are asking that question, what about snow, right? And they certainly do still eat snow, but think of that as more, it's not a direct use of hydration. Snow is something that sled dogs and other polar species tend to eat usually as a source of cooling down, right? You're getting that temperature change. But if they're just if you think about it solely for the purpose of hydration, it's actually quite costly. So energy-wise, they'd have to spend a lot of their own body energy heating it up in order for their body to be able to use it. So you lose a bunch of energy that way. And then also, snow is mostly air, so they would have to eat so much snow in order to get an equivalent amount of water that they would be at it for a very, very long time. So consuming snow is actually very inefficient way of getting water into your body. Now, I've mostly been talking about sled dogs, but another master of converting fat into water is the polar bear. And this is a quote from Eileen Lorzen. She's a researcher at UC Berkeley, and I love this. I think it's hilarious. She said, for polar bears, profound obesity is a benign state, which is not true for many an animal. But to be a polar bear and to be obscenely fat is one of the best things you could possibly be. And a lot of that, again, is their own genetics and their own adaptations, right? So the amount of fat and cholesterol that a polar bear, that a happy, healthy polar bear needs and carries with them would be enough to sink our metabolisms as humans. We would never survive under that. And partially they have these genes that essentially allow them to use the cholesterol in a completely different way. They can, their diet is mainly fat, and so it's all geared towards converting that fat into water and that fat into energy. And so their efficiency is just through the roof. And like a happy, healthy polar bear would really be, half their weight would be comprised of fat, which when I think about that is quite crazy, quite a large amount. And so if you think about it that way, a polar bear is sort of similar to a camel, because the Arctic, again, I know there's snow and you have the seawater, but the Arctic is really very similar to a desert. So in the same way that a camel carries high concentrations of fat, it can travel a long time, so can a polar bear. Those fat reserves, it's like carrying around a water jug. That's what they're using to survive most winter, especially polar bears who live in the high Arctic, who spend nearly their whole life entirely on the ice. You know, there might be like spring, there might be a little bit of melt ponds or things like that where it'd be less saline and they could take a sip. But for the most part, you know, more than at least 90% of their water consumption is just them consuming fat. They're not drinking really very much at all. So yeah, as a polar bear, their whole life revolves around that fat. If you're a nursing cub, that their milk that they're nursing from is at least 30% fat. Their main diet, when they're eating seals and things like that, it's blubber. They will, when hunting is good, they'll strip the fat off and leave the rest of the carcass for something else, right? They're not even that concerned with the protein. They'll eat some of it, but they're like when you imagine a brown bear fishing, and when they're eating the salmon, they just eat the cheeks or something like that. It's the same thing. They're just after that really, really high, dense energy food. And so that's when they're consuming food. Now, polar bears' life cycle is flipped. So they, unlike other bears where they hibernate in the winter and are active in the summer, polar bears metabolically have very little activity in the summertime because that's when hunting is poorest or they're forced on land because the sea ice has melted. So polar bears, that fat store that they're carrying around, they really need to bank that up in the spring because depending on conditions and body health, they're losing up to 4 pounds, but let's say 1 to 2 pounds every single day. So a female bear that might weigh 800, 900 pounds in the spring may only weigh 500 pounds come the fall because she's used up all of her resources throughout the summer to carry her through that fasting period. So polar bears use their fat reserves to get them through these really intense environments. But for sled dogs, that fat reserve is equally important, but used in a much different way. And sled dogs almost have a switch where they can change their own metabolism and the way that they consume fat, which I think is very, very fascinating. So for you and I, when we're running and we run out of energy in our muscles, so when we have our muscles store glucose, so not quite sugar, but similar, like glucose and glycogen, they store in your muscles. And when you're doing a lot of exercise, you run out of that glucose in your muscles. And then you start getting tired and you feel fatigued. But if you're a sled dog, what happens is that you flip a switch and you actually start taking fat from another source. So not just where it's banked in your muscles. So there's a really cool study a handful of years ago by these researchers who were studying sled dogs. And the sled dogs were training for the Iditarod. And so they were running 100 miles every day, which I know sounds crazy, but for a sled dog is actually quite obtainable. It's very comfortable to do, depending on the terrain, anywhere from 8 to 10 miles in an hour. So it's a long day, but it's very doable. And so what the researchers were doing was at the end of every day, they were actually taking a small sliver of muscle from their back leg, something similar to just a matchstick. It wasn't too much. And they were looking at it, and what they were looking for was how the proteins and the enzymes and the glycogen changed from the first day. So they were doing this, I think they ran them for 10 days doing this, which is what you end up doing in the Iditarod, more or less. It's kind of similar. And so they ran them. At the end of every day, they would take a little bit of muscle from them, and they could see how that changed throughout the race. And so what they found was that once they'd used up the reserve in their muscles, they flipped the switch, and they were actually able to take the fat directly from their blood, which is something humans are not able to do. So when you and I are working out, that's when we started getting tired. But that point where we start to get tired, they switch and start using fat from a completely different source, which when they've looked into this, they found that part of the reason they're able to do this is that there's something to do with insulin. And so researchers are really keen to find out how this process works because they think it could really help people with diabetes. Another reason why this is possible is that when we look at their muscles, so when we look at dog sled muscles, they have way more mitochondria. So that's like that's the generator in our muscles. That's the one that's making all the energy. So just the density of that, they simply have more of them. But they noticed that sled dogs don't flip that switch until there's really intense training periods. And so researchers are also looking into how different intensity of training, if that same thing can be possible in humans, and trying to find that line. So it's really, really very cool how these adaptations come together, and all the things that we can learn from them. So I feel like we've covered a lot about sled dogs and their physical adaptations, but I wanted to also take us through a little bit of how sled dogs work as a team and how we as the human fit into that team. So when you have a sled dog team, dogs have different roles. So in the front, we tend to call those our lead dogs. And those are the ones who are listening for our vocal commands. And so if you're driving a sled team, your left and right is your G and your ha. And we get those words from Teamsters, when people used to pull horses and plows and carriages, and things. It's the same vernacular that they would use. And that's where that comes from. And so when you're at the back, right, the only, as the driver, even though you're not as the musher, the only commands you have are sort of stop, go, slow down, and left and right. And you're doing that all from the back. So you have to have some well-trained and very trusted dogs in the front who you know are listening for your words and who are paying attention to the trail. Sled dogs have amazingly good memory. If you take them down a trail once, they can remember that. Even if you never take them there for a year, they will remember that trail the next year. It's amazing to see what a good dog is capable of. Behind those are often our swing dogs. So usually you'll have more than one well-trained leader. So those might be maybe older leaders who will sort of help the team along and pull that way. And then at the very back, our last sort of special role are what we call wheel dogs. So wheel dogs are the ones, they've got to have quite a bit of, what's the word I'm looking for here? They got to be able to sort of hold their own weight, because they're the ones who are closest to the sled. So the dogs at the front of the team don't often feel the weight of the sled directly when it shifts from left to right. But if you're a wheel dog, you're going to feel that shift. So they got to be really kind of quick on their toes like a ballerina, but they also have to have enough that they can keep that momentum forward and they don't sort of get that swaying motion. And then our team dogs are our dogs in the middle. And so I remember something my boss, Jerry, said to me once. He said that a good dog is one that you never have to think about when you're in a team. And so it's the one who's consistent and happy and healthy, because it's the dogs who, you know, who aren't paying attention, or it's the dogs who don't want to eat their food. Those are the ones that you spend all these time thinking on. But a really good sled dog is one who's just happy to be in the middle, happy to keep trucking forward. And those are some ideal team dogs. You'll see them smiling and jumping, and they are just happy to run. And those are the ones that sort of make up the engine, as you were. And if you'll notice, there's a little bit of difference between our left and right here. So the orientation of our team on the left is linear. So that's some people call that a gangline formation. And then on the right, we have a fan hitch. And so those are two different forms depending on what environment you are running in. So if you're out on the open ice, you want to have your dog set up in a fan formation. And if you think about that, there's a few things. One, you're in a treeless environment, so there's lots of room for your team to spread out and pull forward. You don't have to worry about necessarily dodging obstacles. But a big one is because you're going over sea ice. And depending on the sea ice in various thicknesses, you don't want to concentrate the whole weight in a very dense area. So if you spread out the dogs, then you're spreading out that weight as they move over maybe some rotten ice or things like that. It's a safety thing. And so when you have a fan, you still have a lead dog. When you imagine a fan, right, you've got that curve. So the dog at the front is still your lead dog. They still need to have a sense of direction. They still need to have, right, and their line will be longer than everyone else's, and then everyone else's line is shorter going backwards. Then if you are sledding in a more southern environment where you have trees and rocks and things to avoid, then you want that straight line formation. You want to be able to weave and dodge as you go. So on each individual dog, they have what we call the pole line, and then they have a line also attached to their collar. There should never be really any tension on the collar. All of it, the harness is designed to pull from the back. And the line in the middle that they're all going to be attached to, oh yes, so that actually tends to have, in newer days, certainly, a long time ago they wouldn't have had this, but the center line actually has a wire cable running through the center of it, because the worst thing you could possibly have is that line breaking and having your team getting tangled or running off. That's one of, as a musher, that's one of your biggest concerns, is the last thing you want is a tangle. Another thing is that the dogs tend to chew the line. If you get some anxious dogs, you know, you thought trying to get your children not to chew their nails was hard. If you have an anxious dog who's like kind of excited and not quite sure what they're doing, some of them will actually grab their line and chew on their line, which is another reason why we have that wire center line. So this is a picture of one of my first teams. You can see we've stopped. Some of them are taking a bite of snow. They're pretty giddy to go right now. And one thing I find quite cool is actually how we set up the sleds themselves. So the front of the sled, we're looking at that diagram there, it's got the brush bar, so you've got that wire cord so that you don't want to get hooked on anything, right? You want to have a nice smooth front. You're packing all your food and your gear in the sled bag. The runners are actually very similar to the way we think about skis. So you can have runners where the plastic is, the colder the weather, you want more bendable plastic, and then the warmer the weather, you want it to be sort of harder so that it has that glide. So if you're a skier, if you're a surfer, you're still trying to do that whole balance of friction. It's equally valid for a sled. And the other thing I try to make the equivalent of is when you are mushing, you have a parking brake and you have your regular brake. So if you look at the picture on the top right, you'll see in this design anyways, there's a bit of a board in the middle. So when you're driving a team, you have your feet on either runner, and then in the middle you have what's called the brake. Usually a brake and a drag. So the drag you put on just when you want to slow them down a little bit, and then the brake usually has some smaller hooks, and that's when you really need to dig in. So those are your brakes for when you're doing corners or when you're pulling up to someone or something like that. But your parking brake is actually more aptly called a snow hook. And so that's almost designed similar to a boat anchor or something like that, where you have a hook. And so what you do is while you're usually still in motion and you're going along, you slow down your team and you'll pop that hook in and it'll hook into the snow. And as the team keeps pulling forward a little bit, the tension will drive the snow hook down. One of the more to be honest, scary things when you're learning to dog sled is, especially early fall when there's not enough snow, it takes a few inches, half a foot or so snow to make a reliable anchor there. And when that pops and the team gets excited and runs off, that's thankfully never happened to me, but it's certainly one of the things I used to be most terrified of, was losing a team. Which brings me to the first piece of advice I was ever given while dog sledding, which was to never let go. My boss at the time told me that no matter what happens, you never let go of that team, never let go of the sled. He's like, short of breaking a leg, you hang on, because the dogs they'll get excited and they'll just take off. They're not, unless they're super tired out, they don't really care whether you're there or not. They're just happy to run. So a lot of times we're racing on rivers. So imagine if you're looking at that picture on the right, there's open leads in the water. It's a terrifying notion if your dog team gets away and ends up in water. So that was one of the interesting first lessons that I learned. And actually that scar, not that it's very visible to people who won't necessarily, but if you look in that photo of me, there's a little bit of a dark line under my eye. And that was from one of the first times on a sled. I didn't let go, but I did definitely run headfirst into a tree. The sled had tipped over and the tree was coming. I remember it went whack right there, and that was that stayed with me for quite some time. Which brings me to what we look like when we're on the sled. So the dogs are perfectly adapted And so for us, we have to bundle right up. This was at the end of the Percy DeWolf race, I think in 2017. I can remember this race. I remember there was a lot, we were going along the river and there's all this frozen ice, but I remember it was like the last hour. This is at the end of the race, at the finish. I can remember you can actually start to learn and feel the difference between like minus 30 degrees Celsius and like minus 20. And when you go down to a valley or something like that, you can feel the temperature drop. And I remember being about an hour from the finish line and I could feel my eyes freezing closed and I couldn't, and you're wearing these big mitts to keep your hands warm. So I just sort of like I could barely see. And then I'd sort of like tuck one off and like rip the ice off my eyes so I could see again. And then it would freeze up within the next 5 minutes. And so by the time I got to the end, I just sort of let it happen. And someone caught a picture of me rolling in looking like that. But there's these little considerations, like for us, when we need to drink on a race, we have insulated water bottles with hoses, but you have to be, and so you don't really want to have to, you're wearing these big gloves, so you don't want to have to work with a lot of little things. And so one little hack is that you actually have a insulated water bottle with a hose and you drink from the hose, but you always have to remember to make sure that that the liquid goes all the way back down so you sort of blow, because if the straw freezes, then you're out of water for the rest of the race. Which was another interesting, all these things that you end up learning that you never thought you would need to know how to do. How am I doing? Oh yeah, we're good on time. And so this is a video of not my very first race, but I believe this is about halfway through my first year. And so hopefully this will play all right. I'll let that go. Yeah, so I wanted to share the story of my very first dog sled race, which was a 100-mile race north of Whitehorse in the Yukon. This video is not of that. This was of a few months later, but it's actually at the same place, so you get to see some of the same corners and things that I took. So how to start this story? The winter that I moved up to the Yukon to train dogs for the Iditarod was there wasn't a lot of snow right away. So I moved up there and we did run the dogs, but we would run them behind while they would pull an ATV because there was no snow. And so finally it snowed enough. And so my boss took me out once and it was just a big open path and we took the dogs for like a midnight run. And, it was very short. It was maybe only 4 or 6 hours. And I did 2 of those. And then there was enough snow and the community was really excited. So they're like, all right, let's host a race. And so my boss put me in it. And so my third time ever on a dog sled was in a 100-mile race, which when you're doing that takes about 20, depending on the breaks you give the dog, but that's about 24 hours. Because usually races have allotted breaks to make sure that everyone gets enough rest. Here we go, we're kicking off now. So you can see how excited they all are. But yes, back to the story. So third time on our sled, and I can remember my boss telling me that he's like, well, you've never really learned how to corner yet. Because when you're on a sled, it's very similar to skiing. You learn to shift your weight on tight corners and you kind of lean and you need to get your balance back. And he said that the place we're going to has a lot of really sharp corners. So you're pretty much going to have to learn how to turn or you're going to fall a lot. And that was the advice I got. That was about the extent of it. And I was like, okay, great, sounds good. And so we pulled up I remember I had so much adrenaline at the very first time. I actually blew through this start line. I was so nervous that I forgot to stop, and the officials were yelling behind me. And anyways, it was a big fiasco. But we took off, and I can remember the very first. It was almost like a 90-degree corner, and I was so nervous. And I remember I went to make it, and I completely biffed it. I'm holding on to the sled. The dogs are all excited. And what happens when you tip over a dog sled is that you actually want the sled to fully tip over, because if it doesn't, the dogs will keep running. And so, but once the sled tips over, there's enough friction on the side that they'll stop. But you have this very tedious moment where you're standing when you're standing the sled up, and in doing that, there's no friction anymore, and you don't have access to a brake, which means that the dogs just want to run. And so you actually have to do it in one fluid motion. You have to pull the sled up and go at the exact same time, which takes quite a bit of fancy footwork and balance when you're learning to do it. So I will fully admit that there was probably 5 or 6 really good falls within the first half an hour before I learned how to weave through all these trails. As you'll see here, we're going to take off through some of those right now. There's not too many sharp turns right from the get-go, but yeah. But probably one of the most adrenaline-filled moments of my entire life was halfway through my first race. I took a wrong turn. And by I saying I took a wrong turn, I was telling the dogs to go G, which was right. But one of my lead dogs, who at the time was named Red Bull, he was very adamant that we should go left. And left took me down a hill, and he was taking the team. And so I couldn't stop them in time from taking the wrong turn, but I did get him stopped at the bottom of the hill. And I didn't know where the road went. I didn't know how to get back to the race. I was terrified. And so I took that hook that I explained and I hooked it onto a tree. And my boss, like the guy who owned the team, he'd never explained how to turn around a dog team before. He just said, make sure they never get tangled up. And so what was so I thought about it for a second and I realized I didn't have a choice. So I got off the sled and I walked to the front of the team, and I'm on a very narrow track. And so I walked to the front of the team and I grabbed the lead. I grabbed Red Bull because he'd gone the wrong way. And my heart's just pounding, because if that hook at the back pops and I lose the team, the dogs and I are in a whole whack of trouble, because we are, 30 miles in the middle of the night away from everyone else. No one is coming to help us, or no one knows to come and help us for a very long time if I mess this up. So heart pounding, grab the team, run them in a U. So I pulled a U-turn, probably one of my most impressive driving skills. I pulled a U-turn with a dog sled team of about 10 dogs. And the dogs are trying to mix with each other as they're doing the, so I've got them going. And as I'm doing that hook on the tree pops off. And so now I need to let go of the front dog and have the whole team turn and run past me. And I have to catch the sled. And I remember like the last, and I caught the sled and I whipped around, and we were going up that hill, and the dogs were super excited, and they were just running because they could tell I was excited. They thought I was excited about something. I was just nervous about how I was going to get out of this mess. And I made it to the top of that hill. And yeah, and then one of the other teams just so happened to be up there, and they saw me, and they're like, where are you? It's like, how long have you been down there for? And I was like, and I didn't know whether I was down there for 5 minutes or 20 minutes, but it was, oh man, that was one heck of a night, to say the least. And so I made it. I didn't place very well because I had that big U-turn, but I made it through my first race in one piece. And yeah, I can remember there was a good point. I think that was the very, very beginning, right? That was my first month of being up there. And I can remember in the last month of trying to, I didn't have to turn around a dog sled team, but I remember something happened. I had to pop up, and I was so good at that point of like catching a dog sled team and whipping that around, that I sort of look back on that first race and sort of laugh and think about how crazy it was, because my boss threw me straight from the frying pan into the fire. But on a more happy note, if you would like to try dog sledding, you can actually do it on our tours in Churchill, Manitoba. So I'm a polar bear guide in Churchill, and one of my favorite things is that we get to take our guests out to a couple different kennels that are local to Churchill, and you get to take a ride on some amazing teams, meet some really great mushers up who are from there, and you don't have to do a 100-mile race, I promise. I think you do a mile or two, which, trust me, at minus 30 is usually enough to get some good, even then it's enough to kind of freeze your toes and your fingers. So if that's something you're interested in, please take a look at our Churchill trips, and I hope you get the chance. I hope you get the chance to dog sled someday. It is certainly, yeah, one of my favorite experiences, and just one of the best times I think anyone could really ever have. It's so good to reconnect and to be outside with our four-legged friends. And how am I doing on time? I think with that, Kendall, maybe I'll pass it over to questions, because I see we're getting close to the top of the hour.
Yeah, great. No problem. That was so interesting. Thank you so much, Kristina. And before we start the Q&A, I just want to remind everyone who's watching, if you have a question today, you can submit it in your control panel under the questions field. All right, someone here is just looking for a little clarification if a sled dog is actually a specific breed, and they're also wondering if Malamutes and Huskies have been bred more for house pets rather than these working dogs.
That is a great question, and this is one of my favorite things about sled dogs. So unlike when we talk about other breeds, we think about pedigrees, we think about lines, and that does exist within, if you want to call them Huskies or sled dogs, whichever you prefer. But there is no official like lines. Like there are like, you know, in the same way, like we know that this person, you know, you can like follow your grandparents or ancestors line. There isn't an official pedigree book for Huskies. You can't register, and so it's really great because the genetic diversity is super duper wide. Now within that, there are like Greenland Huskies. There are some that people have like given pedigrees and sort of subset, but I really like it because then you don't end up with things like, you know, Cocker Spaniels who always have hip problems, or, you know, pit bulls who have breathing problems, because they want that genetic diversity. So if you ever looked into these really famous Iditarod racers or sprint racers, they will breed in, you know, a greyhound, and there'll be a little this and a little that, and so they get this really great mix. And then as far as the question about working dogs, so I will say this, part of it is always temperament. Some of these working dogs can be house dogs. I say that with a very tentative tone though, because they do require a very, very active lifestyle and a lot of stimulation. So you can have that. There is a distinction between the sort of like generic husky that you find, you know, that people have in different communities around North America or other places in the world, and also like racing huskies. But there's so that's sort of just sort of the mixed breed. But then an actual like Canis familiaris borealis, the true Inuit sled dog, it's almost like looking at like a refrigerator. Like they're very bulky, very like those ones I would never ever have as a pet. They're insanely aggressive, very territorial. Not that it couldn't be possible, but it's not done, and it's not done for a reason.
All right. So if someone's looking to go to Churchill, what's the best month for dog sledding?
Ooh, so dog sledding, the dogs are happy pretty much anytime. I would say, if you're interested in doing like dog sledding and the Aurora Borealis, then you can definitely jump in on those February trips. If you're doing the polar bear tours, which is in the fall, so there's October, November is usually the season. If you're like, man, I really want to see polar bears, but I also really want to have a great time dog sledding, I would lean more towards the end, because in early October, you can still dog sled, but you're not on sleds. You're actually on, they've got wheels. They're almost like small chariots. I think they're actually really cool. And so that can be fun too. But if you want the snow and the full feeling, then sort of aimed for that later October, November period.
And I have to say, several years ago, I was in Churchill, and I was on a very early trip, so there wasn't much snow, which all other aspects were wonderful. You could really see the polar bears pop against the tundra. It was fabulous. But so I did ride in a cart, and while some people may say, you know, that's maybe not as authentic, I had such a good time. It was really fun.
They're really cool. Like the little engineering of them, and they're you do sort of feel Roman a bit, anyways. But
yeah,
whatever you prefer.
I agree with you. Okay, a couple questions about the dogs here. At what clip, how fast are the dogs running most of the time during a race?
Yeah, so it depends. In an ideal team, it depends the length that you're training them to race for. So Iditarod teams, like a winning Iditarod team, will consistently run at 9 miles an hour throughout the whole race. So that's what you're training them for. You want them to sink into about 9-10 miles an hour. If you're like, let's say if you're a sprint team, then your dogs are going to run much faster, but you know, sprint teams are only expected to race maximum 10 miles in a day, right? So they're going to crank out like 15, 16, maybe a bit more. I'm not as familiar with like really good sprint teams, what their numbers are. So like our team, for example, that we used to race, we tried to get them to consistently be at that 9.5 mark. But I won't lie, I did get really stoked when like they'd see a squirrel and get excited and bolt, and all of a sudden you just feel like you're flying.
So in a race or intense training, how often do the dogs need to eat?
Yeah, so generally the dogs have a primary meal in a day and then several snacks, and then I mean, we would call it slop, very technical term. But so when you're trying, the biggest thing is getting enough water and calories in. And so the calories are usually not too hard because they're very excited to eat, but to actually get a dog to drink when they're like, when it's you and I, right? Like when we're working out, we do want to drink because we're thirsty, but we don't want to sit there and guzzle a liter, even though that's kind of what your body needs. And so people will do this differently depending on preferences, but usually what will happen is you'll mix a little bit of food. So it's sort of like a very liquidy oatmeal with some ground beef or pellets or whatever you're mixing up. So you'll have that in the morning, and then depending on the length of the race, you might feed them their next meal 6 to 8 hours in between. But then you'll stop. It depends on the length of the race, but you'll stop every couple hours and like you'll go down the line and give each one a snack and give them a little, give them a little bit of attention and see how everyone's doing.
All right, so final question here, because I know you need to get going for some schoolwork you've got. So at what age are the pups when the mushers decide which ones will have certain positions on the team?
Ooh, this is a very fun question. There's so many things I could get into. I could honestly talk about this for 3 hours. One of the most exciting things is the very first time a pup gets hooked up to the sled. They don't have to carry any weight. It's just them getting to experience it for the first time, and you usually put them with a lot of older dogs. And so the older dogs have the momentum going, and within 1 mile, you will see them sync up their step to the dog next to them. It's insane, actually. To see them like really just like become like a unit that way, and they're still excitable and they're still everything. So usually the first time they'll ever go on the line is what usually you say is anywhere between like anytime after 6 months. They're not expected to work. It's just a fun little like they go for a little bit, then they come back, and just to get them used to working as a team. Roles that you start seeing in personality. So anywhere around a year mark, you'll start to see the ones who maybe are a bit more assertive. That's a big part of it, right? So the ones like if you're for selecting lead dogs, it's the ones who tend to they're not assertive is the right word. They're paying attention. You can watch their ears actually. The ones even if they're not in front, the ones you'll see their ears listen to you and their head sort of turn when you're talking. A little bit you'll see just different traits in that. And so if you see that, sometimes you'll just try the whole team. Sometimes, for a week, it's like, okay, today you're in the front. You just see how each one, because to be honest, there were some lead dogs who I would have never thought picked lead, but then you put them up in the front and like in the middle, maybe they were like, I'm having a good time, but not really. But then you put them at the front and all of a sudden they're loving life. And then you're like, oh, I would have never thought that Gypsy was going to be a great lead dog, but look at that. There she is, right? So that's sort of part of it. And then a thing that comes down to personal preference is some people think about like, oh, dogs, this dog should always be on the right, should always be on the left. I was trained, and we trained our dogs that it's like you want them to be as versatile as possible. So there are some who are better in different spots, but the idea is that you don't want them to have, oh, I only run next to this dog because I'm happy there. You want them to be a fluid unit. Some people did only have their dogs run a specific spot, but that can get tricky, right? If you need to change things around or one dog isn't feeling great one day, so they stay at home, well, then your whole thing is kind of thrown out of whack.
Well, that was so interesting. This was absolutely fantastic. Thank you so much, Kristina. We are past the top of the hour, so I'm going to hand it back over to you for closing comments.
Thank you, everyone, for joining me. This is one of my favorite topics of all time. I someday hope to have my own team, so get back up into the north eventually. But I think for me, being up there and being in that really intense environment, I appreciate so much how adapted they are and how the relationship goes both ways, right? Like we as humans couldn't survive up there without them, and they are so much a part of our life there, and it's this back and forth. And so I think it's just a really great example of humans and fitting into their environment and being a part of it, and we change it and it changes us. So yeah, I hope everyone has enjoyed a brief journey up north today.
Absolutely, we all did. Thank you so much, Kristina. And my thanks as well to everyone who tuned in today. Join us tomorrow for our next Daily Dose of Nature. You can check out this and next week's lineup later this afternoon, including registration links on our website at nathab.com/webinars. We did record today's presentation and we'll have the replay available on our website soon. And with that, I'll conclude the webinar. Goodbye, everybody.